Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the 34th event of this year's festival. I'm John Dean. I expect a lot of people probably fed up with seeing me this week by now, but anyway, there we are. Can I first of all thank Johnny and Sophie Bowden, who there they are, very much indeed for sponsoring this event tonight. And Johnny, I hope you're properly turned out tomorrow for Remembrance Sunday. I'm sure you will be. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Liam Fox, who will be very well known to, or will be known to many of you in the audience tonight. Liam graduated in medicine from Glasgow University and became a general practitioner before going into politics. And of course, during 32 years that he was MP for North Somerset, he held many posts, both as a minister and Secretary of State. He was Secretary of State for Defence in 2010, and in 2016 was Secretary of State for International Trade. He's also been chairman of the Conservative Party at some time, and also twice ran for leadership of the Conservative Party in 2005 and 2016.
I was robbed.
So there's not much he doesn't know about politics. I even asked him if he'd met General Z, to which he said he'd had dinner with him. So, I mean, you know, there's not much he doesn't know what's going on around the world. His first book was published in 2014, which was called Rising Tides, Facing the Challenges of a New Era. But tonight we're going to discuss his new publication called The Coming Storm, Why Water Will Right the 21st Century. Liam, a very warm welcome to the Bridport Literary Festival. You've been described by Michael Dobbs as the modern Noah, and I must ask you whether you've actually built your ark yet, I suppose. A term of endearment?
With Michael Dobbs, you're never quite sure. I might build a political ark, but that's a different discussion. Michael has been very helpful and given some very kind reviews to the book. But we discussed it one night over dinner, and he was asking me, why would you write this book? And I'd said that it came from a number of different influences, my time as a doctor, as you mentioned, and the fact that I think it's disgraceful, that 3.5 million people die a year from waterborne diseases in the 21st century, when even developing countries are sending, spacecraft to the dark side of the moon. There's something really way wrong in the ethics in that. And also, the fact that, as Michael and I discussed, one of the problems we have in the West, particularly in government, but probably every government, is the inability of people to join the dots. So water is quite an important issue in global health. It's quite a big issue in global security. It's quite a big issue in global trade. It's quite a big issue in global economics. But it's never the top issue for any of them. So it never gets the priority that it requires, and no one really cross-references its importance. And so I wanted to write in a way that told a story, first of all, not a textbook, but that people could take the bits that they wanted from it, but could see the whole picture. It was largely, I have to say, driven by John Major, because John Major said to me, in your first book, I liked the short section on water. He said, but I've plagiarized it ruthlessly, and I'm running out of things to say. Could you possibly write a whole book on the subject? So I had a drink with him a couple of weeks ago. Well, I said several drinks, but and pointed out to him that it was his fault that my wife's been bored to death with statistics about water for a year. So, but I think it's achieved its purpose. We launched it in America and in Salt Lake City, second driest state in the United States, and the reaction in the States as well has been very, very positive. So. My measure of success would be that people bore one another to death in dinner parties by saying, "Did you know that?" Whatever. So I think that's how I would see its success.
There'll be a lot of quite amazing things that we can talk about tonight, and statistics as well. your book is really in 4 parts. You talk about the fundamentals of water to start with, which I found very interesting, and then the geostrategic issues that affect water. And then, of course, as a doctor, you had to, but it was quite right that you should, you talk about disease and
health.
And health,
yeah.
generally. And then, of course, we ought to end with climate change and the effects that the water is going to have on that. But let's start with the fundamentals. We know the planet was created by Big Bang, but how did water get to the planet?
Well, there are a number of questions. Number one, how did water get here, and how did it stay here,
Right.
where it didn't stay elsewhere, given that we're all made from roughly the same stuff? And also then, you have the connection with humans. If we came out of water, it's hardly surprising that we're so dependent on it. And
Sure.
so I wanted to go through that, including some of the evolutionary stuff, which is new. I'm doing the Gibraltar Book Festival next week, and a lot of the information we have about humans and water have come from the new Neanderthal caves in Gibraltar, which we can talk about in a minute. But yes, so for a long time the argument was that we were bombarded by comets and ice, and it stayed on the planet. It doesn't really add up, because the sheer volume of water is not right. So as we now know, we talk about the water cycle. We all get taught about the water cycle at school, with evaporation and precipitation and runoff and so on. We now know there's another water cycle too, the deep water cycle. And you imagine when tectonic plates move, and they move at the bottom of the oceans, it's deeply unlikely that water doesn't move as well. And we do know that the amount of water contained in the anhydrite rocks and molten rocks inside the Earth, plus water that moves down from the surface, means that the whole of Earth, not just the surface, is quite a wet planet, even in its more molten parts. And we've gradually begun to understand that more, and that if you add more energy with more heat into the water cycle, you speed it up. Dry places get drier, wet places get wetter. It's hardly, it's not really rocket science, not quite that simple, of course. But and then when you, the other thing to remember on the basics is that 97% of the water on our planet is in the oceans. 97% is salt water, only 3% is fresh water. Most of that fresh water is locked in the Antarctic or the Arctic or Tibet. And it actually works out that only 0.5% of all the water on the planet is the fresh water we need. And then when you add on top of that, that as a species it took us 200,000 years to get to 1 billion people, and it's taken us 200 years to get to 8 billion, then you start to recognize that that mismatch between the water that we have, that we are able to use for drinking and agriculture, compared to our population, is now reaching an almost Malthusian crisis point.
Because, of course, we're dealing with a finite resource. I mean, there is only so much water on the planet. We're not creating any more.
You can't make, you can't destroy. It's
yeah.
a closed system.
Yeah.
And we might want to, think about that when we're looking at how we use water. I mean, when I was in the States, they were saying, what could we do to help? I said, well, if you're looking at how well we reuse water, at the top of the list you've got Israel at 84% recycling of its water. And then you've got the United States at 7.9. So maybe how you use your water. And the gap is huge. I mean, Israel's up there at 84. Who is second? Spain at 19%. So I'm afraid we're down there under 10 with most Western countries. And we don't think about it as a finite resource in the way that we do with some minerals and other things. And we do need to change how we think about that particular element of the world around us.
Let's talk very briefly before we go on to the sort of geostrategic issues, and we can talk about stress states and where the possible trouble spots are. And I think this is very interesting. But how did man, I mean, life came out of the water onto land. What are the issues there about retention of water?
Well, when I was a medical student, one of the few thoughts I actually gave to the subject in the 5 years I was there was that how come if we just walked out of the forest into the savannah and then round the rest of the world, and we were descended from primates, how come humans don't have primate kidneys? Because we've got the same kidneys as water mammals, like as bears or otters or beavers, much closer in structure. And there was a book in the 60s that was very controversial about the aquatic ape and how water had a much bigger role. It's more accepted now because if you think about it, if we developed a lot of during our evolutionary history by water, it explains why we stood up on two legs relatively early. If we had a high diet if we lived in estuaries and had a high diet in omega fats, it would have matured our neurological systems, including our brains, which again gives you some idea of that. And then the reason that we've had a bit more evidence on that recently was the Neanderthal caves, and also the advent of 23andMe. I can't really see the audience very well, but can you put your hand up if you've done 23andMe and you've had your DNA done? Oh, okay. So as we've got these big databases, we knew for a while that all of us, all humans, have about 2% of our DNA came from Neanderthals that passed down the maternal line. What we didn't know till we got 23andMe and we could do a whole global scan was that it's not the same DNA that we have. In fact, about 20% of the Neanderthal genome is alive in the human population today. So that's important because we now know that the Neanderthals could dive from tools that we found. We knew that they lived predominantly on seafood. Yeah. And so you can see that the pattern beginning to emerge. 2 new caves that have been discovered in Gibraltar, which of course used to extend much further out into the Mediterranean than it does today, about 1.6 kilometers more, is that we now know that Neanderthals went further back in history than we thought they did. So there was a much bigger overlap in time when we did quite a fair bit of crossbreeding according to our genetics. But you can see where the picture is now beginning to emerge from our study of genetics and our better study of archaeology. It was one of the best moments, I think, of my life was Professor Clive Finlayson, and they were still excavating in the cage, and he said, this here we're unearthing is a flint stone, he said, and you can see where bits have been chipped off, where they made weapons from it. He said, if you touch that, you will literally be the first human to touch it, because the last person to touch it was a Neanderthal. And actually, the hairs on the back of my neck are still standing up as I tell that, as it happens every time. Yeah. But we're beginning to discover much, much more about who we are and why water is so crucial to us.
Before we go on and talk about sort of the real world today, let's tell everybody your analogy of the Empire State Building and the steps, because I think that is fascinating.
Well, I think I need to read that out, but to give the full. But
yeah, but I mean, just broadly.
Yeah. So basically, you've got about 102 floors, and by the time you've got to get to about the 90th floor before you discover any really complex life. And you've got however many steps I said it was in the book.
102.
No, 102 floors. I think there's 1,680 steps. I think I said there was. And of all of that evolutionary pathway, you go up and you get to the dinosaurs, who had 3 whole floors to themselves. From the 97th to the 100th floor, were the dinosaurs. We, humans, we're the top 10% of the last step. Of all the steps in the Empire State Building. So a little humility about how long we've been here in our relationship with the planet.
Absolutely. I thought that was fascinating.
You've no idea how long it took me to work out all of that, how many steps did what and how many floors did what. Yeah. I'm glad you appreciate it.
Let's move on. And you've touched on 1 or 2 things on stress states. I think you say by 2030, some 47% of the population are going to suffer from water stress. Let's look at 1 or 2 examples of that, which I think are quite interesting. I couldn't believe the fact that the largest dairy in the world was in Saudi Arabia. Is still. Let's explain that, because it's extraordinary.
Well, what I was discussing, and have discussed at different parts in the book, is whether, we have ecologically appropriate trade in the world. The Syrians wrecked their surface water by trying to grow cotton, the world's most water-thirsty crop, in the most inappropriate place. The Saudis wanted to ensure supply of dairy as a strategic element. So if any of you ever fly from Abu Dhabi or Dubai and you're flying to Riyadh, you'll come across this gigantic circular area. And it's the Al Safi dairy. It's now owned by Danone, where they keep 15,000 Frisian cows in the desert, sprinkled with water at a constant temperature all the time. And it takes, to produce 1 litre of milk, it takes 2,002 litres of water between what they have to do for feedstuff and sprinkling cows. I mean, if you were to find an example of absurdity in terms of water use and appropriateness, that's probably the best one I found for the book. The other thing about that is a much more serious impact on the wider ecology, because under the Saudi Arabian Peninsula is one of the biggest freshwater deposits that were laid down at the end of the last ice age. It was about the size of Lake Erie in North America, and that has been depleted 80% in 1 generation.
It makes you think. What about the Aral Sea? That's an interesting case study as well.
Well, the Aral Sea was created, the ecological catastrophe of the Aral Sea was created during the communist period in the Soviet Union, when they diverted it, again to try to grow cotton largely. And the sea dried up, fish died. Worse than that, it was a human problem, because the dust, toxic dust from the bottom of what had been the sea, caused a massive human health problem. And I put it in the book because it's one of the hopeful signs. Because in the northern part of the Aral Sea, where the government there have redirected the river to flow back into the sea, the fish stocks have recovered years, decades faster than any of the scientific evidence said they would. And it shows that if we're careful, we can actually restore the balance again. Whereas in the southern Aral Sea, where they haven't, it remains a dusty and vile dust bowl. So there are examples out there of where we can reverse our own behavior to produce the sort of results that we are going to need to look at. And you've then got mismatches between who's got the supply of the rivers and who's downstream.
Let's come on to that, because this, of course, is very much a strategic issue. You give a number of examples of potential flashpoints, if I can use that word. And perhaps we should start with Tibet. Taken over annexed by China in 1950. And no one, we thought it was because they didn't like the Dalai Lama, but the strategic issue of
Richard Gere still thinks that.
Of the third ice cap. And there are the major rivers that run out of the Himalaya, makes it a huge resource for the Chinese, and are really worrying for all those countries downstream. How, at the moment, do you apportion water as it runs through country after country who rely on it for their irrigation and crops?
The apportionment I'll come to as a second, but to understand the scale of the problem. We're now in the position where 40%, just over 40%, of all the human beings on our planet get their drinking water or agricultural or industrial water from a river that comes off the Tibetan plateau. 40% of the whole human population. When you think about it, the Indus, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, the Mekong, the Yellow, the Yangtze, all come off the Tibetan plateau. There are 56,000 large dams in the world. China's got 28,000 of them, because China now controls the headwaters of every one of those rivers. As you say, China were not interested in the Tibetan culture or the Dalai Lama. This is about pure control of natural resources. It makes China potentially, almost certainly, the most powerful upstream country in the world, and those downstream at a geopolitical disadvantage. This whole problem is beautiful. It was a beautiful example of where human behavior is making the problem worse, because the glaciers in Tibet are melting twice as fast as any other glaciers in the world than in the Rockies or the Andes or the Alps. But you're correctly asking yourselves why. And the answer is that both China and India, on either side of the Tibetan plateau, use coal to produce energy. And that coal produces a very, very fine black film on the surface of the ice in Tibet, and it absorbs energy rather than reflecting it, unlike any of these other glaciers in any other parts of the world. And what it means is, because it's absorbing heat faster, because it's melting faster, it's producing more flood water in the summer months. So you're getting more, we're actually experiencing more floods in Bangladesh and India now than we have before. That will continue as long as this melting goes on faster, but there'll come a point when there's nothing left to melt. And they will move very, very quickly from flood to drought.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'd be interested if anyone in this audience today doesn't think that will have an impact on global migration patterns when that happens.
Yeah.
And I go back to the point I started with, we've got to start to understand the interrelations between all these things, because we are not thinking them through, and we're not understanding, you know, the impact of where some behaviors will have elsewhere.
Let's look at another example, which is the Nile.
I'm getting really depressed now. I can feel it.
But
Don't be, there's some good stuff at the end.
Let's talk about the Nile, and the sources of which are the Blue and the White Nile, of course, in Ethiopia and the Sudan. And what is Ethiopia doing?
What it has done.
What is it done?
So when I wrote that first book in 2014, I said that Ethiopia is constructing something called the Grand Renaissance Dam. They wanted hydroelectric power to improve the standard of living for the people in Ethiopia, entirely understandably.
Yep.
But that the consequence of building this dam would be that Ethiopia would have complete control over the flow of the Nile. And at the time, people said, well, Sudan and Egypt will never allow that to happen. You know, they'll bomb it. They'll find a way of disrupting it. The truth was that they never had the capability of doing that anyway, even if they'd had the will to do it. And at the earlier part of this year, 2024, it was completed and filled. Ethiopia became the world's first really obvious upstream power, and no one in the world stopped it, and it now has control. Now, there's no evidence that they have any malign intent in that, but they have the power should they do so, and that has shifted the geopolitical balance in the region, and that will not have gone unnoticed in Beijing. Let me tell you, as people there, quite good at joining the dots.
What is the attitude of the Egyptian government towards this?
They are fearful and furious, but impotent. They were not able. It was very clear. I mean, as a former defense secretary, they didn't have the range in terms of aircraft. The land gap was too big for them to cross, and in any case, it was hostile territory. So they were never going to be able to deal with that. And here's a warning for the rest of us. So how do we deal legally with this situation? How do we find international agreements that give the downstream countries not just the ability to predict the amount of water that they will get, but what do they get extra should they experience drought, for example, in one part of that region and another? There are only two bits of legislation in relation to the Nile, a treaty in relation to the Nile. Both of them were done under British colonial times, and they gave a disproportionate amount of water to Egypt, which of course by complete coincidence was ours at the time. There's never been a real agreement. There's some hope, because you did ask that question about how do we find ways of equitably sharing these resources. It's true with Turkey, which effectively is the upstream power for both the Tigris and Euphrates, and therefore has Syria and Iraq on the other end, dependent on them. In general, where people look at water as a sovereign issue, in other words, they say, this is ours, and historically we've had X, Y, Z, it doesn't work out so well. when they look at it as a natural resource and say, this is what we currently use, that's tended to work out much better. So when it's taken on a pragmatic basis of usage and taken out of the ownership issue, agreements have tended to work much better in different parts of the world. So can we get that into a more formulaic basis? Probably we have to, because if you look at places like the Himalayas where they have a water agreement, guess what? China and India haven't signed it.
We want to go on and talk a little bit about health, but before we do, I was fascinated, and I didn't know, and I doubt many people in this room know,
I might have forgotten.
the number of ships that now go through the Panama Canal each day because of the lack of water that's being fed into the canal to support the locks. And I think it's gone down from 40 to 20.
It's down to 50%. Of what it was.
Yeah.
Why? Well, partly that's an effect of the El Nino, La Nina effect, so there is some effect there. But the way the Panama Canal was constructed was that in order to fill the locks between the two oceans, they used fresh water coming from the jungle, and which is why you've got this gap where you can't build anything in Panama on the north or the south of the canal for quite large periods, large areas of land. But as the rainfall has fallen in that part of the isthmus of Panama, not enough water has been going into the canal to allow them to fill and empty the locks. So we're, as a result of purely natural climatic functions, we can discuss whether we're exacerbating them, you've got a big restriction on global trade, so only half the amount of shipping, half the amount of consumer goods that we would want are coming through the Panama Canal. Again, it's another example of where an effect in one place will have an effect in another place that we didn't quite think through.
Let's move on and talk about water and health. I mean, you say 50% of human excrement remains untreated. 20% of the population have no basic sanitation, which is an appalling thought, but maybe not terribly surprising. And 3.5 million people die of waterborne diseases, you say, every year.
2.2 million of which are children.
Exactly.
I was speaking at the Royal Commonwealth Society a couple of weeks ago, ahead of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting where water is one of the big issues. And these are people who are pretty well versed in the subject. And I was saying exactly those statistics. And I said, but you don't get it. And they said, what do you mean? I said, because that number doesn't mean anything. 3.5 million people dying, what does that mean? I said, that's the equivalent of 3 9/11s every day, or 6 Titanic sinkings every day in the 21st century. We would never tolerate either of those. And yet we don't seem to feel as guilty as we absolutely should over what is a terrible way in which we treat our water. And it's not just, incidentally, where you would think in South Asia or Africa. One of the examples I give in the book is that the Danube, major European river, which is, if you've been a sail on the Danube, well, this may change your view of how that was. The Danube is pretty clean until when you get through the earlier parts of it, until it gets to Serbia. Yeah. So Austria, Hungary, Vienna is lovely. That's genuinely the Blue Danube. When you get to Serbia, it's not the Blue Danube any longer because they've got 30% of the population of Belgrade have septic tanks which are discharged directly into the Danube. And they put 60,000 Olympic swimming pools of untreated human waste into the Danube every year. So from that point onwards till it gets to its discharge in the Black Sea, it's not something I want to go swimming in, let me tell you. That's not in the developing world. That's in Europe. And the way we treat our water is shocking, and we have the ability to deal with it. We just don't. And I think the bit that shocks people on that section is when we talk about what would the cost be to actually clean all that up. What would the cost be to give every human being in the world access to clean water and sanitation? It's a project I've been working on with WaterAid, which if any of you don't give to WaterAid, there's one thing that I would ask you to do tonight is to do so. One of the world's greatest charities, in my view. But it would cost about 150 billion a year, every year between now and 2030, to give everybody access to clean water and sanitation. And it sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money, except that it's 150 billion. We spend 107 billion a year on cosmetics, and we spend 1,690 billion a year on alcohol. So it would, in fact, you could give everybody on our planet clean water and sanitation for 1/10 of the global bar bill. It is a different way of looking at the problem. And I purposely put that in to be kind of provocative, so that it would make people think differently about how we spend things.
Sure. We haven't got time to talk about the various diseases which you talk about in your book, but one was mindful the other day of polio raising its head again, both in Gaza and, as you were saying, in the Thames a couple of years ago, I think.
2020, yeah.
Why is that?
Why? Because, as with all immunization programs, if everyone doesn't get it, we'll all be put back at risk. And when the Taliban, who are largely responsible for this particular problem, started to tell people not to get Western vaccines, because this was not about treating their children, this was about the West injecting them with nanoparticles and control from the West, the usual conspiracy nonsense. It actually took the highest level of Islamic leadership in Mecca through the Saudis to actually put out a statement saying not only was it wrong to put your children at risk, but it was sinful and un-Islamic to do so, which largely redressed some of the problem that we had there. But you've got Afghanistan, where the problem was, they're the single biggest source of refugees around the world, and will be taking some of their potential poliovirus with them. So it's very important that when we're looking at people who are refugees, that we make sure that they've been properly immunized, because it's not just them that would be at risk, all of us are at risk if we allow these diseases to re-emerge. And when we've spent so much almost completely eliminating them, we've done smallpox, we've almost done polio, we're this close.
Are we doing that, for example, to the illegal immigrants that are coming across the channel? Are we checking them for polio, for cholera, and all these?
Well, a lot of that will be dependent on information that people themselves can give you. I mean, if you were to ask this audience there, can you prove that you've had your polio vaccine?
Well, they don't come with a passport, so I'm sure they don't come with.
So exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. And so we should be, especially with children, ensuring they get all their full immunizations. But we can eliminate a lot of things in the world at relatively low cost. Typhoid, for example. We've done very well on something called dracunculitis, which is guinea worm disease. It's like, all my friends found this, they were bizarrely and sort of obscenely fascinated by this bit of the book, which is guinea worm disease. You get it from larvae in open lakes, and when you ingest the water, it goes from your digestive system into your skin, and it generally comes out your leg as a big blister, and a little worm crawls out, a sort of urban legend type thing, but it actually does happen. And we've reduced that from tens of thousands of cases a year in the 1980s to a few hundred in 2020. I think last year there were 54 cases worldwide.
And
we can do it. It's within our power to do it. And
does the WHO decide where the priorities are going to be? I mean, if we did spend 150 billion, would it be the WHO that would decide on the allocation of resource?
It is. It always comes up against national governments and how willing they are to cooperate with the programs. And then you've got, the hierarchy. One of the things I always found really bizarre was, with the UN's development goals, their Millennium Development Goals, water came number 6, access to clean water came number 6, and it came below gender equality, which seems to me quite bizarre, because you cannot have gender equality if in the developing world lots of women and girls can't get educated because they're carrying water. It's real cart before the horse time there. you cannot be economically active if you've got a waterborne disease
Very sure.
in a developing economy. So these things all get, they need to all get put together in, as I said, in a proper, where we join the dots on all of it. And we've got great examples of where we can make a difference. And we've got examples of where the global geopolitics has been influenced. When in 1947, when Mao Zedong and the communists were chasing Chiang Kai-shek out of China, and he took refuge in Taiwan. And it has relevance today because the Chinese were about to invade Taiwan to get it back. And they realized that lots of the people in the People's Liberation Army couldn't swim. So they had all to get swimming lessons, and they got them all to swim in the waters and canals where there was very high levels of schistosomiasis, where the snails were infected. And they had the biggest ever human outbreak, 30 to 50,000 cases of rashes and illness. And the Chinese called off their invasion of Taiwan simply because of a single waterborne disease, which has actually shaped the politics to this day.
Yeah, interesting. Let's move on finally to global warming, because of course this is something that we're all hugely aware of. We've seen storms Helene, Milton, we've seen the chaos in Valencia recently. As far as water's concerned, we really talk about two things, salinity and temperature. How do the two react? How do the two interact?
How long have you got?
About 5 minutes.
So it's basic physics. Water will sink when it's colder or saltier. And this is what keeps the global circulation working. It's driven by wind, by the direction of the Earth's spin, by solar power, which of course changes because of the Earth's tilt. And basically, as water, first of all, the oceans are not equally salty across the ocean. So the Atlantic, which is by far the saltiest ocean compared to the Pacific, I was surprised at when I was writing this, I was quite surprised at the difference. So the Atlantic is least salty around the equator because it's got the highest rainfall and the biggest runoff of fresh water. As it moves north, past the Sahara and so on, you get more evaporation and less rainfall. And then it gets, as you get melting water in the poles, the two poles, it gets less salty again. As it gets colder, however, and some of that less salty water freezes and puts the saltiness back, as it gets colder, it sinks. And while the superficial currents, like the Gulf Stream, are driven by the winds, these deeper currents go right down to the seabed. They flow right back around the world again. They transfer heat around the world. They make sure that our ecological balance is maintained. And disruption to that would have a pretty unknown effect on us. At the same time, the thing that we are absolutely clear is totally 100% our fault is what we're dumping into the sea. So we now have somewhere between 15 and 50 trillion pieces of plastic in the world's oceans. In the first decade of this century, of the 21st century, we made more plastics than have been made in history up till the beginning of the 21st century. 4 countries in the world are responsible for dumping more plastic in the oceans than the rest of the world combined. That's China, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia. Congratulations to our great human species. We've just had our first snowfall in the Antarctic with microplastics in it. So we've now managed to get everywhere. And you cannot treat a finite resource, which is how we started, and just treat it as a garbage dump, which of course is produced in the Pacific, the giant garbage patch, which flows round and round and round. We can do something about that. And we need a sense of urgency about it, and we need to, for countries that are responsible for by far the vast proportion of the pollution, we need to find sanctions to be able to, and carrots and sticks, I would say, to encourage better behavior. Otherwise, what we do have will be the situation which is that about half of all the fish landed now in California have got plastic in the guts of the fish. So,
yeah. And
Pick
finally,
your restaurant carefully.
finally, we know that water temperature, the sea temperature, is increasing. And I think for every 1.3% increase in water temperature, there's a 9% uptake of evaporation within the clouds. And that is creating what we, to a degree, saw in Spain 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, so you've got a couple of things in there. So first of all, so every 1 degree that the air warms, it can absorb 7% more water. So you can see how putting more energy into the system just drives greater and greater activity. It's not, as I said at the beginning, it's not rocket science. And that's one of the big effects we've had. The second is, and this was one of the things that made me actually write this chapter of the book, because I was so stunned when I heard this. It was a senior, I won't say who they were or even give their rank, but a senior person in, let's call it, the British government. He said to me, I don't really buy that the global, that the oceans have risen by somewhere between 10 and 20 centimeters in the past century, depending where you are on the globe and tides and so on. He said, because not enough ice has melted. And this is one of my real bugbears in life, that we don't have enough people in government in general, or the civil service in general, who've done science. Right? They've all done PPE at Oxford, that's a generalization. So we had a pandemic where they were really hot on Rousseau but didn't know what RNA was. And I said, but you do understand thermal expansion of water? And this is a total blank look. And I said, well, like everything else, water will expand as it gets warmer. So it's not just the melting of the ice that will increase the volume of the ocean. It's as it gets warmer, it takes up more space. And we reckon that of the increase in the volume in the past century, about 50% is ice melt and about 50% thermal expansion. The trouble with that is the excess heat's already in the system. So it's, in the next century, it will go up by about 30 centimeters if we can control temperature rise, and about a meter if we can't. And the difference is that the ice melt will contribute about 25%, but the thermal expansion that we've already put into the system by the increased temperature will be about 75% of that. It'd be really nice if we could teach kids in school about thermal expansion of water, because it would give them such a head start when they're trying to discuss some of these other issues.
We must draw this to a close, but before we do, let's look to the future. Are you optimistic that some of these issues globally we can address and do something about? You touched on one or two that we've had a marginal success. Are we going to control climate change?
So I'm kind of optimistic by nature. It's when people say, Liam, are you a glass half full man or a glass half empty man? I just say, well, I'm Scottish, the glass is just not big enough. But I do think it's within our power to do so. We know that we can control diseases because we've done it. We know that we can do desalination because we've done it. There are lots of things that we can do. There are lots of examples in the book of really optimistic ways forward. Jordan and Israel, by using a huge amount of capital given to them by the UAE, are in the process, or they will be, of doing an electricity for water swap. Israel now produces more fresh water by desalination than it actually requires, but it doesn't have enough electricity. So the UAE have given Jordan a huge amount of money to build vast solar arrays where they'll produce more electricity than they need, and they'll swap their excess electricity with Israel's excess water. Now that seems to me a perfectly reasonable, constructive way to go forward. We've got to find lots of ways of doing that to combine sensible political behavior with improvements in our own technology, which will be ultimately the answer. We've got to look at some of these geopolitical pinch points, work out the problem before we get to a crisis, and try to find international solutions to that. And then we've got to get people to change their behavior, everything from how much they recycle to remembering to drink water. I can't see how many people in the audience are over 50, but you may or may not know, it's just not gentlemanly to ask, but what you put these two pieces of information together which you may or may not know. First of all, think about it. Every time we get a really hot spell, lots of old people die in a heat wave, much more than in a cold snap. Why should that be? Because in humans, once you get past the age of 50, your thirst mechanism doesn't work properly. And the older you get, the more your body doesn't tell you to drink. So the older you are, the more you have to remember to drink, because your body will put you in danger. And you would think with the amount of money we spend on healthcare in the Western world, maybe that one piece of information actually given to people might be a good use of our time. But hey, as I say, why would you want to join up the dots?
Yeah. Great. Right, let's have some questions. I'm sure there are a huge number. I can't. Abe, just one, the lady just there.
Hi, thank you so much for fascinating insights. I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on cloud seeding and weather manipulation?
It's very early days in the technology, and what's not known is what negative effects it might have. You might be able to produce more artificial rain, as it were, from that, but what else might you be doing that we don't quite understand yet? So, as with all our technologies, worth exploring. We need to invest a lot in them to try to understand them, and we'd be well to understand them before we unleash them. I think is probably how I would see it.
Gentleman here in the front row.
Thank you. When we pay for our water, we have a standing charge, then a cost per unit. And the same with gas and electricity. It would be sensible, would it not, to have no standing charge and low cost per unit for basic needs, and then as you got more extravagant, to have higher costs. What's wrong with that?
Well, the standing charges we have at the moment are a racket, to be frank, and they have gone up way disproportionately to the cost of water itself. And yes, if you could meter it properly, if you could measure it, there would be no real reason in theory why you couldn't say for everyone got a certain amount of water at a lower rate and a higher tariff if you used it more. I think it would be a purely practical problem with metering. I'm not a big fan of smart meters myself at the moment, given some of the problems that we've had with them. But in theory, which is quite different from practice, I don't really have a problem with the concept. The way that Israel dealt with it was that they actually dealt with it the other way around, which was everybody had to have a particular type of shower head that was much more efficient. And they regulated how people used water and forced everyone to have a more efficient use of water. But they did also really ratchet up the unit price. And so people had to think twice about how much they were using in a part of the world where there simply isn't enough, and where it's exacerbated by the population growth. I mean, Israel had I hope I got these figures right. In 1970, Israel had something like 2.7 million people. Now it's got 9.7 million people with the same amount of water. So the amount of water per capita per year has dropped very dramatically. And that's even worse in Jordan next door, which has gone up from 1.4 million to 11.3 million in the same period. So it's a kind of a carrot and stick, isn't it? It's encouraging people to do things properly and to reuse their water when they can, but also to make sure that they pay a financial price if they don't. Interestingly, when in London, in the Great Stink of 1857, when we decided that we had to do something about the quality of water. When I say we decided, it took until Disraeli got fed up with the smell in the House of Commons before we actually decided to do anything, never mind the rest of London. But when they decided to do that, and they built 1,000 miles of sewers in London in the 1850s, late 1850s, the way they did it was that they allowed a 3-penny surcharge on all water users in London for 40 years. That's how they paid for it. So these are not new ideas.
Two gentlemen here in the front.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Dr. Fox, for a fascinating analysis. Turning to kind of the solutions, if you were let's say, the global water supremo, or the water tsar, to use a current expression,
Yeah.
then what would be your top, taking a 10-year view, let's say, what would be your top 3 reasonably achievable practical solutions to help address this situation?
Well, number one, I would be ensuring that we did have a proper program in the global aid program to get everyone clean water and sanitation. First of all, it's ethically wrong that so many of our fellow human beings die from waterborne diseases, and they don't get access to what we take for granted. It's quite wrong. And when we think of some of the things we do spend in our aid and development programs, we have to ask ourselves, are our priorities correct? And do we need to change that? So that's one. It would also require, at an international level, to get the cooperation of governments, that this needed to be done and this was to be their priority. So in India, for example, where you've got the highest number of people in the world who are defecating in open spaces, but sending a probe to the dark side of the moon, you'd have to ask, should we be providing development aid in these circumstances? And if we do, should we not be determining what we think the priorities are? In the development world, that's a really nuclear debate. Secondly, we do need to find international solutions for water sharing. We know that the problem is coming, and we know that the problem is worsening, and yet we don't really have the legal mechanisms to deal with it. We need to think about those, and then we need to think about what are we doing with the quality of the water that we've got globally. We cannot be allowed as a generation simply to poison the water for future generations, and it needs to be a real global priority. And we need to understand the interaction between all of these, how climate change, disease patterns, pollution are driving the other problem that we do worry about here, which is migration. And you cannot allow the degradation of global ecology and expect it not to have an impact on where people would go, because if I was living in the Mekong Delta and the fish were dying and I could no longer fish there, or I was in a developing country that was not allowed to trade its way out of poverty because we were increasing protectionism, I think that I might get in a boat as well. And when I was Trade Secretary, I kept trying to explain, particularly to my American colleagues, that if you do this in a world where young people can pick up a mobile phone and see what prosperity looks like, don't expect them to want to live in squalor. It is not a rational thing to do. And yet we keep driving the very trends that we complain about. And to use a medical analogy, we spend all our time worrying about how we treat the symptoms, not how we deal with the basic illness.
Gentlemen, there.
Two-part question. The first part really is of the available percentage, and a small percentage that you said is fresh water within the world systems. What proportion of that do we actually use or need? And the second part really is about the severe and ever increasingly severe climatic events that we see. How do you see that compromising our ability to utilize that which we do currently use?
Wow, two great questions. So the first is, of course, as I said, we actually, of all the fresh water, of all the total water in the world, only about 0.3 to 0.5% is available for our use as fresh water. Now, we have found ways of supplementing that through desalination, for which we now have much cheaper and more effective technology. It brings its own questions because there's a byproduct to desalination. What do we do with it? You can't stick it back in the ocean because it kills everything. This very, very heavy contaminated brine. So you have to put it somewhere. The holy grail at the moment is to find a way that you can take that, split it into chemicals, which you can then use again in the desalination process. Israel is by far the most advanced country on that because they've had to be. So need has driven innovation. Our problem is not just the water, but the elephant in the room, which is the rise in the global population, is so rapid. I mean, I'm not ones who think that we will end up with a such a bad crisis that will destroy part of our human population and sort of start again. But we're going to see, again, where people are running out of water, they'll go to places where there is water. If I were to pick a place in the world to go and live, to ensure I had water, I'd be in South America. The aquifer, the Garano aquifer, which sits under parts of Argentina, parts of Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, is not only the most quickly replenished aquifer in the world, but has got sufficient fresh water to give everybody in the world drinking water, at current populations, drinking water for 200 years. But that's not where the population is. The population's in the driest bits of the planet, and we've not found a way, we've not got any way to match them. So that is a key pick. Sorry, the second bit of your question, which was a great question too.
It's the increasing severity of climatic events and how they in themselves compromise how we currently utilize water and may increasingly compromise it.
Well, the big problem there is the driver of it, because you get countries like the UK, Germany, a lot of Western countries who have dramatically reduced what we're doing in terms of production of warming gases. But it is more than outpaced by the rise that's still occurring in places like China, India, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, the countries who are massively increasing their greenhouse gases at the present time. And there has to be some way of dealing with that, because there's a limit to how much we can cut in the developing world, in the developed world. And we need to, again, find ways of ensuring that we don't put ourselves into a position where we're getting resistance from our own population because of the measures we're taking at a time when they're letting rip on the other side of the world. And part of that is what I call in the book ecological trade. Now, take this at its simplest level. It's about producing things in the right parts of the world for the right resources that you've got. So as I said, growing cotton in Syria destroyed their entire surface water and ecological system, to the point that 2 million people moved from the countryside in 2 years into Damascus and Aleppo. And then you wonder why you got a civil war and instability. But I would like, as a consumer, I'd like to be able to say, well, I bought this cotton shirt, and it's labeled to tell me whether this was grown in a place that's ecologically sustainable. But we don't get that as consumers, because at the World Trade Organization, they can't get agreement on how you would do that. And how many people in this room, if you had a choice, you would actually choose to buy something that came from an ecologically sustainable place? And someone said, you've got a red label cotton shirt and a green label cotton shirt, and if you buy the red label one, you're going to destroy the potential environment of those countries. And what are you going to do? Is you're intelligent, sophisticated, ethical people. But we don't get agreement on that. And we need to also, it's a big subject to touch on, but talk about virtual water in trade. How much water was used to create this particular product? And should you be encouraging countries who are producing those to do so? As I said, it goes right back down to our diets. It takes, I'm not sure, I hadn't read these numbers today, but it takes about 1,400 litres of water to produce a pound of beef. It takes about 540 litres of water to produce a pound of chicken. If the Chinese population develop a taste for beef, not chicken, that has a very big impact on what happens globally. And just in case you're feeling smug if you're a vegetarian, the single most water-intense crop on the planet are vanilla beans. They take more water to produce per kilogram than anything else on the planet. So just keep it in balance.
Well, I think we must call a halt there. Liam, you've given us much food for thought, and I'm sure all of us here will take away one or two nuggets from that talk. We live in very interesting but dangerous times. And of course, none of us in this room really realize how valuable a commodity, a resource water is. But hopefully we're a bit more aware tonight than we were earlier today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, John. Thank you.